Thrumming began on the second night. Felt in the sternum before any man could name it. A single deep pulse transmitted up through the keel and into every timber of the hull, as if the ocean floor itself had exhaled. By the fifth morning, there was nothing left of the Endurance Star, except the memory of her captain turning his wheel deliberately broadside, and the sound of 11 men I could not save, becoming smaller and smaller behind us in the dark. My name is Henrik Voss. I am 34 years of age, born in Bergen, Norway, and I have held maritime certificates in the colony of Tasmania for 11 years. At the time of the events I am about to describe, I held the rank of first mate aboard the support tender Albatross, a vessel of 212 tons registered out of Hobart, operating under charter to the Southern Shelf Fishing Consortium, a trading company incorporated in Victoria. I am giving this account under oath to the Hobart Harbour Board inquiry because I was present for all 5 days of what occurred south of Macquarie Island in February of 1903, because I am the ranking surviving officer of the fleet, and because I believe that whatever the board intends to do with my testimony, or not do with it, the record ought to exist in full. I have been asked to confine my account to what I directly witnessed. I will do my best to comply with that instruction, though I will say at the outset that what I witnessed does not confine itself easily to any category of direct observation I had previously considered within the limits of my profession or my understanding of the natural world. I will tell the board what I mean by that statement as I proceed, but I want to name one thing at the front of this account so that there is no confusion about where it is going. On the morning of the third day, I saw what I saw. I will come to that. And I want the board to note before I arrive at it that I had already, by that point, argued for an immediate withdrawal from the channel, that my argument had been voted down by a margin of 4 captains to 1, and that the record of that vote should be entered alongside this deposition so that anyone reading this account can understand what might have been different and what was not. The Albatross sailed from Hobart on the 14th of February 1903 as part of a 6-vessel trawling fleet. The consortium had organized the expedition to exploit a krill current running at depth along the ice shelf margin south of Macquarie Island, a current that the consortium's marine advisor, a Dr. Emil Bolder, had identified from temperature readings taken by a survey vessel the previous austral summer. The theory was straightforward enough. Where krill concentrated, so did the larger fish that fed on them, particularly the Patagonian toothfish, which was by that time commanding serious prices in the London market, and the consortium believed that a fleet working the current at the ice margin, in waters no commercial trawler had previously thought worth the risk, could fill holds in 2 weeks that would take 2 months in conventional grounds. I will note for the board that I had reservations about the enterprise before we departed, though they were practical reservations, not the kind a man could easily set down in a logbook without appearing overcautious. The ice shelf margin in that latitude is not a hospitable operating environment, even in the austral summer. The leads between pack ice are unpredictable. The weather changes with almost no notice, and the waters in question had not been charted to any standard I would consider reliable for close maneuvering in an emergency. I raised these concerns with the consortium's operations manager, Mr. Aldous Frey, a week before departure. He thanked me for my thoroughness and said that the captains had all reviewed the risk and found it acceptable. That was the end of my formal objection, because there was no mechanism within my employment for a further one. The fleet was composed as follows. The lead trawler was the Endurance Star, 940 tons, Captain Rolf Amund commanding. Rolf Amund was a man I had known for 6 years and respected genuinely, a Danish-born fisherman who had worked South Pacific grounds since his 20s and who operated his vessel with a kind of calm competence that I have not often seen matched. I want the board to understand that I respected him. What passed between us in the final hours of the 5th day did not happen because I thought him a reckless man. The second and third trawlers were the Morna Bell, at 410 tons, Captain Jack Pierce, and the Caldera, at 600 tons, Captain William Frost. Pierce was younger than me by 3 years, and had a reputation among the Hobart fishermen for pressing his luck, which was not always a fault in those waters, because the men who pressed their luck sometimes found the grounds everyone else had abandoned. Frost I knew less well, a taciturn Cornishman who said very little and operated his vessel with mechanical efficiency. The fourth and fifth trawlers were the Albathin and the Grace Solander, both at roughly 500 tons, under Captains Lund and Devereux respectively, and the Albatross, under Captain Peter Hook, was the fleet's support tender, lighter and faster than any of the trawlers, carrying fuel, spare gear, medical supplies, and myself as first mate. I want to name one more man for this record because his name will matter later. The Albatross carried a deckhand and engineer's assistant named Paweł Czerwinski, a Polish immigrant of about 20 years who had signed on for his first deep ocean voyage. He had a way of doing his work without complaint that I had noticed early in the voyage, and when things became bad, he was one of two men on the Albatross who did not freeze or panic, and who did exactly what I told him, without requiring me to explain why. The crossing to Macquarie Island took 3 days in moderate seas. The weather held and we pushed south of the island without incident, entering the ice-margined channel on the 17th of February. The channel was roughly 12 nautical miles wide at its northern entrance, and the ice pressed in from both sides in long, flat sheets and occasional pressure ridges that rose 15 to 20 feet above the waterline. The krill current Dr. Boulder had predicted was precisely where he had said it would be, running at about 40 fathoms, and when the trawlers put their nets down on the first evening, they came up heavy with toothfish of exceptional size. I heard the cheering from the decks of the other vessels from across 200 yards of open water. The mood in the fleet that first night was genuinely good. I will tell the board now what happened on the second night, which was the 18th of February 1903, and I will try to be as precise as I can about the order of things. We had anchored loosely in a cluster, 6 vessels within a rough circle perhaps a quarter mile in diameter, at a position I estimate as approximately 63 degrees south and 162 degrees east, though my navigation notes from those days were lost with my cabin kit when the Albatross's stern was struck in the final pursuit, and I cannot give the board an exact figure. The night was clear, which in that latitude and that season meant a sky of extraordinary density, stars crowded to the southern horizon, and the ice reflecting what light there was, so that the darkness was not absolute, more a kind of cold blue-gray that let you see the outlines of the other vessels at rest around you. I had come off the first watch at midnight and was in my bunk when I felt it. I want to be careful here because I know how this will read, and I am not in a position to dress it differently. There was a sensation in the hull timbers beneath me, a vibration that did not match any mechanical source I could identify, not the engines, which were at low idle, not the anchor chain working against current, not any category of vessel motion I had experienced in 11 years of seafaring. It was a single pulse, deep and even, and it lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and then stopped. I lay still for a moment. I am not a man who startles at ship noises. I have slept through storms that sent other men to their knees on the deck. But this was different in a quality I find difficult to articulate precisely, except to say that it was not a sound in the ordinary sense. I felt it in my chest, in the bones of my ribs and sternum, before it reached my ears at all. The lantern above my bunk swung once and was still. In the hollow beneath the bunk, where I stored my sea boots, I could hear the faint rattle of the boot buckles against each other. I lay there for several minutes. Nothing more came. I attributed it to a seismic event, a submarine tremor of the kind that is not unusual in those volcanic latitudes, and went back to sleep. I learned the next morning that at least 4 other men across 3 different vessels had felt the same pulse at the same time. Powell came to me at breakfast and described it before I had mentioned it, which is important because it rules out the possibility that I communicated the sensation to him in advance, and he confirmed it as social agreement. He said it woke him and that he thought it was a whale, a very large whale sounding close to the hull. I told him it was most likely seismic. He nodded and went back to his work. We fished hard through the 18th, pulling the nets up twice in the late morning and once in the afternoon, and the holds of the trawlers continued to fill. Captain Amund signaled by flag that he estimated the fleet had taken perhaps 30% of what he hoped for by the end of the season's work, and that if the current held, we would be in excellent condition by the end of the first week. The mood remained good. Captain Pierce of the Morna Bell rowed across in his dinghy to share a bottle of something he was evidently proud of, and he and Captain Hoke and I sat in the Albatross's small wardroom for an hour that evening, talking about the prospects. I remember Pierce was particularly pleased with the size of the individual fish they were taking. He said he had never seen toothfish of that weight this far south, and speculated that the depth and cold of the channel were producing something exceptional. The second pulse came that evening, at approximately 7 o'clock, while Pierce was still aboard. It was stronger than the first by a measure I can only describe as noticeable but not alarming, and it lasted perhaps 5 or 6 seconds rather than 3. The lanterns moved more definitely this time, and Pierce set down his glass and looked at the floor of the wardroom for a moment, as if listening to something through the planking. He said he had felt similar things twice the previous night. I said I thought it was seismic. He said it did not feel like the submarine shocks he had experienced near the volcanic fields east of New Zealand. He said it had a quality more like a sound produced by a living thing. Then he appeared to reconsider, saying that aloud in front of a first mate he did not know as well as he knew the consortium's captains, and he let the observation go, and we moved back to talking about the catch. The pulse came 3 more times that night at irregular intervals, each time a single event separated from the last by perhaps 40 to 60 minutes. By the third occurrence I had stopped attributing it to seismic activity, at least to myself, though I said nothing different to anyone. The sensation in my chest when it passed through the hull was unmistakable by then, an organic quality, a breathing quality, as if something of immense size were exhaling at intervals deep beneath us. By the fifth occurrence, which came just before dawn, I noticed that the bilge water in the lower hold, visible through the grating, was moving in circular patterns when the pulse passed through the vessel, spreading outward from the center and interfering with itself at the hull walls like a struck bowl of water. I stood and watched it for a long time after the pulse had passed. The patterns decayed slowly, long after I expected the vibration to have dissipated. That detail stayed with me through everything that followed, and stays with me now. On the third morning, the 19th of February, I requested a meeting of all 6 captains aboard the Endurance Star. I want the board to note that I did not yet have a visual report of anything, and that I was operating on what I recognized was an accumulation of physical sensations and the behavior of bilge water, which is not, in the strict sense, a robust evidentiary basis for recommending the abort of a commercial fishing operation. But I will also say, and I want this entered into the record clearly, that 11 years of working these oceans had given me a category of judgment that is not fully expressible in formal language, and that judgment was telling me, with increasing certainty, that the pulses were not seismic, were not mechanical, and were not produced by any whale species I had knowledge of. Captain Amund was a fair man, and he let me speak. I told the captains that I was concerned about the nature of the vibrational events we had all experienced over the previous 2 nights, that I believed they were increasing in frequency and strength, and that I thought the prudent course was to bring the nets up, retain what we had taken, and move the fleet north to the open water above the island before we had more information. I said that the channel's geography, the ice pressing in from both sides and the limited sea room for maneuvering at speed, made it a poor place to be if we needed to move quickly for any reason. Captain Frost said that what I was describing sounded like seismic activity, and that the channel floor in this part of the sub-Antarctic was geologically active in ways that were well documented. Captain Lund agreed with Frost. Devereux said that if we abandoned the grounds on the basis of vibrations in the night, he did not know what he would tell the consortium, and that 30% of a hold was not 30% of a season's income. Captain Pierce did not say the vibrations were seismic, but he said he was not prepared to abandon ground this productive without a clearer reason, and that if we retreated every time the ocean produced a noise we could not immediately explain, we would spend our lives in harbor. Captain Amund listened to all of this. And then he looked at me for a moment in the way that men who have been at sea long enough look at each other when they are trying to separate what they know from what they can prove. And he said that he agreed the vibrations warranted watching, and that he was going to keep the fleet in a tighter formation going forward, with running lights maintained through the night, and that if the phenomenon increased materially in either frequency or intensity, he would call another vote on withdrawal. That was the most I was going to get, and I accepted it. Though I want the board to understand that the margin of that vote was 4 captains against my position, and 1, Captain Amund himself, who was cautious but not willing to commit to immediate withdrawal. In the ledger of how I have lived with what happened, that meeting on the morning of the 19th is the entry I return to most often. We fished through the 19th with the fleet in a closer formation, the trawlers working in 2 pairs with the albatross ranging between them. The pulses continued through the afternoon, arriving now at intervals of 20 to 30 minutes rather than 40 to 60, and they were measurably stronger. I measured this as precisely as I could by placing a tin cup filled to the brim with fresh water on the chart table in the albatross's wheelhouse and watching it when each pulse arrived. In the morning, the surface of the water trembled lightly. By mid-afternoon, the surface was breaking into small waves that sloshed against the rim. By the time the sun declined toward the horizon, the water was moving over the edge of the cup and wetting the chart table at each pulse. And Powell, who had noticed what I was doing without being told about it, stood at the wheelhouse door and watched the cup with me and said nothing. The first visual sighting was made at approximately 9:30 in the evening of the 19th by the crew of the Albathan. Captain Lund sent a signal by lamp. I was in the wheelhouse, and I read it myself. It said, "Object observed north of us, approximately 800 yards, bearing approximately 340, vertical column, pale in color, estimate 15 to 20 feet above surface, request identification." I took the albatross's signal lamp and asked him to describe the object further. He replied, "Column too wide for mast wreckage. No navigation lights. Appears to be moving slowly east, visible against ice background." I went to the bow with the long glass and looked north-northwest. It took me perhaps 2 minutes to find it against the ice background because the color was so close to the ice itself, a pale gray-white that caught the reflected starlight in a way that was different from the surrounding surface. What I saw through the glass was the upper portion of something vertical, rising from the water and tapering slightly as it rose. At the range Lund had indicated, it was difficult to gauge the diameter, but the proportions suggested something far wider than a ship's spar or a piece of ice. I watched it for perhaps 90 seconds. In that time it moved perhaps 30 yards east, which at 800 yards of distance meant a pace that was deliberate rather than drifting. Then it descended, smoothly and without turbulence visible at that range, until it was gone below the surface. The pulse arrived 30 seconds after it submerged. It was the strongest yet. The tin cup walked off the chart table and struck the floor. I will not claim in this account that I knew then with absolute certainty what I was looking at. What I will say to this board is that the correct identification was available to me from the evidence in front of me, and that I proceeded from that moment as if the correct identification were accurate, and that in every action I took from that point forward, I was operating on the assumption that we were in proximity to a living animal of extraordinary size, one that was demonstrably aware of the fleet's presence and was engaged in behavior that was purposeful rather than coincidental. What the taxonomy of that animal might be, what name a zoologist might attach to it, is a question this board is better positioned to contemplate than I am. I will confine myself to what it did and what we did in response. I reported the sighting to Captain Hook immediately, and then signaled all captains. I reported what I had seen without embellishment, and I repeated my recommendation that the fleet move north immediately, abandoning the channel and the catch. I was overruled again, this time with more heat, particularly from Devereux and Frost, who were by that point each carrying what they estimated as 50 to 60% of a full hold. I want the board to understand the commercial logic. A full hold of Patagonian toothfish at 1903 London prices represented the better part of what a man like Frost or Devereux could earn in 18 months of conventional fishing. They were not irrational men. They were men who had put a number against the risk and found it still acceptable, or found themselves unable to accept the alternative, which may not be exactly the same thing, but produces the same result. Captain Armand told the fleet that we would maintain close formation through the night, with all running lights and the anchor watch doubled on every vessel. He said we would reassess at first light. I returned to the Albatross and told Captain Hoke that I believed we were looking at something, being very careful about the amount of time it spent visible on the surface, and that its surfacing followed a pattern of reconnaissance rather than accident. Hoke was a quiet man, and he listened, and he said he would trust my judgment on watch, and that I should wake him the moment anything further developed. I will come now to the events of the night of the 19th to 20th of February, and I want to prepare the board for the fact that what I describe will sound like the account of a man whose judgment was impaired by stress or darkness or the extremity of circumstance. I cannot prevent that reading. I can only say that I was not then, and am not now, a man given to fancy or exaggeration, that I have given sworn testimony before maritime bodies on 4 previous occasions and been found a reliable witness in each instance, and that the thing I am about to describe was observed by more than 20 men across at least 3 vessels, some of whose depositions I understand the board has already received, and which I trust will be consistent with my own. At approximately 1 in the morning of the 20th, the creature surfaced in the midst of the fleet. I was on watch in the wheelhouse. The Albatross was anchored at the center of the fleet formation, and I had a clear line of sight to most of the other vessels. The pulses had been arriving every 10 to 12 minutes through the late evening, and had begun to carry a quality that I can only describe as interrogative, as if each one were directed differently from the last, focused toward a different point in the hull, rather than passing through the vessel uniformly. This is the kind of observation that I know is difficult to credit, and I note it only because it was consistent with what followed. The surface of the water between the caldera and the Morna Bell, a gap of perhaps 200 yards, began to change. It is difficult to describe what a body of water looks like when something of that mass is rising beneath it from depth, except to say that the surface does not simply break, it lifts, as a tent lifts when a man rises beneath it, and the lifting is gradual and enormous, and has a terrible patience to it. The water rose in a broad dome between the 2 trawlers, and then the neck came through it. I will give the board my honest dimensions. I am a man who has worked next to ship masts and derricks and shore cranes for most of his working life, and I have a trained eye for vertical measurement. What I saw rise from the surface of the ocean between the caldera and the Morna Bell stood no less than 70 feet above the waterline. I arrived at that figure by comparing what I saw against the height of the caldera's mainmast, which I knew to be 62 feet, and the column cleared it by what I estimated as at least 8 feet. It was not a mast. It was not ice. It was a neck, a column of animal tissue with visible surface structure, ribbed or plated in a regular pattern that the reflected light of the fleet's running lamps picked out clearly because the structure threw small shadows at regular intervals down its length. The color was the same pale gray-white I had seen through the long glass earlier. The diameter at the waterline I cannot give the board with any confidence because the scale was disorienting, but the narrowing as it rose suggested something in proportion with the height. A thing built for the water and for depth, and not for surfaces and visibility. The head was lateral. It did not come to a point. It was broad and flat in its widest aspect, wider than our beam, which was 31 feet, and it sat on the neck with a slight forward tilt, like a man reading something set before him on a table, and it turned slowly, perhaps 45 degrees in each direction, in a scanning motion that brought it to face each vessel in the fleet in sequence. The pulse came as it surfaced. It was not a distinct event this time. It was a continuous tone, felt in the chest and the teeth and the bones behind the ears, that did not stop while the creature was above the surface. I could hear the crockery rattling in the wardroom behind me. I could feel it in the soles of my boots through the deck planking. The compass needle on the binnacle ahead of me was circling freely, as if it had lost all reference, and it continued to circle for several minutes after the creature submerged. I want the board to note that I did not run. I tell them this not as a matter of personal pride, but because it is relevant to the accuracy of my observation. I stood in the wheelhouse door with one hand on the frame, and I watched for the full duration of the surfacing, which I estimate at between 4 and 6 minutes, and I noted every detail I am now reporting. I was afraid in a way that I cannot compare to any other fear I have experienced. A fear that was not simply the reasonable response to danger, but something deeper, something physiological, as if the proximity of the creature at that size activated something old and involuntary in the body. But I did not move from my position. When the creature submerged, it did not dive vertically. It drew the neck down in a long, controlled descent that took perhaps 30 seconds, and as it went down, the dome of lifted water collapsed back inward slowly, creating a wave that rocked all the vessels in the fleet and broke over the bows of the 2 nearest trawlers. The Caldera's anchor chain snapped from the surge, and she drifted 40 yards before her engines brought her back under control. The Morna Bell's bow lantern was carried away by the wave. Every running light in the fleet had been visible to the creature during its surfacing. It had looked at each vessel. I believe it was counting. In the hours between its first surfacing and first light, the creature surfaced twice more, each time at the periphery of the fleet rather than the center, each time with less of itself visible above the surface, as if it were testing the fleet's response to partial rather than full disclosure. The second surfacing showed only the upper 3 feet of the neck and the lateral spread of the head, barely above the waterline, moving slowly along the southern edge of the fleet before descending. The third was simply the head, nearly awash, moving through the gap between the Grace Solander and the Albathin on the eastern side of the formation. I do not know what the creature was learning from these approaches. I am not a zoologist, and I am not in a position to speculate about its cognitive processes. But the pattern of behavior was consistent with an animal that was systematically acquiring information about the size and disposition of a group of objects before committing to any single action toward them, and in my experience, the only animals that do that are predators. At first light I was on deck, and Powell was beside me, and we both looked at each other without speaking, and then I went to Captain Hoke and told him that the fleet needed to leave the channel immediately, and that I intended to make this recommendation with a good deal more force than I had used in the previous meetings. Hoke said that after what had passed through the hull overnight, he was prepared to support me, and that he would back any formal motion for withdrawal I chose to bring. The captains convened on the Endurance Star at 7 in the morning of the 20th. Every man among them looked the way I imagine I looked, which was like a man who had not slept and was trying to process something that did not fit into the categories he had relied on to understand his life up until this point. Pierce had a long cut above his left eye from where he had struck something in the wheelhouse during the wave surge. He was wearing it with a kind of blankness that was very different from the easy energy he had shown 2 evenings before when he rowed across with his bottle. I made my case. I said that what had been in the water with us overnight was a predator of a size that made the fleet's vessels comparable to the fish we were pulling from the water, in terms of what it was capable of doing with us if it chose to. I said that it had surfaced 3 times, and that each surfacing was more deliberate and more proximate than the last. I said that its behavior was consistent with an animal that was assessing a group of prey before selecting from it. I said we needed to bring up the anchor chains, abandon whatever was in the nets, and run north at full speed through the ice channel, and not stop until we were above Macquarie Island in open water. This time, the vote split 3-2. Armand, Pierce, and Lund voted to withdraw. Frost and Devereaux voted to remain, and I want the board to understand the specific nature of their objection, which was not that they disbelieved what I was describing or what they themselves had seen, but that they did not believe they could pull their nets without the process taking approximately 6 hours, That in 6 hours of remaining stationary, they were as vulnerable as they would be if they stayed another day, and that the alternative they preferred was to spend those 6 hours bringing the nets up and then run north with full holds, splitting the risk of the extraction period against the commercial return. This was not an unreasonable position in the abstract. It was a position that assumed the creature would permit them 6 hours, and that assumption was wrong. I note for the board that I was not a captain, and that the authority structure of the fleet placed these decisions with the captains. Armand, as lead captain, could override the others in matters of immediate safety, but the borderline he was operating on was genuinely ambiguous, and he was trying to manage the cohesion of the fleet, rather than fracture it further. He brokered a compromise. We would begin withdrawing nets immediately. We would run north as each vessel completed its extraction. We would not wait for the last vessel if it took too long. It was not the clean break I wanted, but it was a decision, and we began to implement it. I went back to the Albatross at roughly 8 in the morning of the 20th, and I told Hoke the plan, and Powell began preparing the vessel to move. The Albatross had no nets down, being a tender, and we could move at any time. I want to tell the board now about something that happened at roughly 9:30 that morning that I have thought about many times since. Powell came to me with an object in his hand. He had found it along the waterline on the starboard quarter of the Albatross, wedged into the gap between the hull and the rubbing strake at the waterline, in a position that required a man to lean out over the rail to access it. He had noticed it when he went to check the rubbing strake for damage after the wave surges of the previous night. The object was a scale. Not a fish scale in the ordinary sense, but something of altogether different proportion, roughly 3 feet in length and shaped like an elongated oval wider at one end, pale in color, the same pale ivory gray I had seen on the creature's neck, and rigid, with a density and solidity that felt more like boilerplate when you rapped it with a knuckle than anything biological. The edge was sharp in places where it had apparently been under stress, and there was a faint iridescent quality to the surface that was most visible when the light hit it at an oblique angle, a kind of oily shimmer that reminded me of the inside of a mussel shell enlarged to an absurd degree. I held it for a long time. Its presence on the Albatross's hull raised a possibility I had been avoiding, which was that the creature had already made contact with our specific vessel, had already come close enough to scrape against the hull in the night or in the half-light of the early morning, and had done so either without our awareness or without choosing to make the contact anything more than a touch. A scale the size of what Powell handed me, given the proportions involved, came from an animal whose smallest individual body part was larger than the largest fish I had ever pulled from any ocean. I put the scale below in the log chest in my cabin, which I will return to for the board in a moment, and I went back to watching the net extraction. The morning was lost to the complexity of bringing up nets under pressure. The creature was not visible, and the pulse continued at its new interval of roughly 8 to 10 minutes, present throughout the morning, but not accelerating, which I read as the creature maintaining awareness of the fleet's activity, rather than responding to it. By noon, the Albathin had cleared her nets, and Captain Lund began moving north through the channel. The Grace Solander was close behind. Pierce on the Morna Bell was struggling with a fouled net mechanism, and his crew was working hard in the cold to clear it. Armand's Endurance Star, with its heavier gear, was still mid-extraction. Frost and Devereaux were working at the pace they had committed to. And then the pulse changed. I cannot give the board a precise time for when the character of the vibration shifted, because it was a gradual transition rather than a sudden one, but at some point in the mid-afternoon it began arriving not as a single distinct event with silence between pulses, but as something approaching continuity. A low, sustained tone with the same chest-deep quality as the distinct pulses, but without the intervals of quiet between them, as if the source were no longer cycling through approach and withdrawal, but had simply committed to proximity. My teeth began to ache. The water in my tin cup on the chart table was in constant low motion, and the compass needle on the binnacle, which had recovered its normal function after each previous surfacing, began to drift without the stimulus of a surfacing event, circling in the same slow freehand arc I had observed the night before, but doing so now, at 3 in the afternoon, in clear daylight, with no visible surface disturbance. The Morna Bell was still in the channel. Pierce had cleared his net fouling, and was beginning to move north, but slowly, trailing gear. His running position was now the southernmost in the fleet, with the Endurance Star and the Caldera between him and the Albatross, which was holding position at the southern edge of the open water, ahead of the ice margin, to act as a reference point for the other vessels coming north. The creature came from the south. I will tell the board what I observed, because what I observed is the only thing I am in a position to testify to. At approximately 3:40 in the afternoon, the ice on the southern flank of the channel, the solid shelf margin rather than the drifting pack, lifted in a section perhaps 300 yards long, rose perhaps 20 feet, and then fractured and tilted as the body of the creature passed beneath it at speed. I saw this clearly through the glass from the Albatross's bridge. The displacement of ice was followed by a bow wave that spread across the channel at a speed I cannot calculate, but that was considerably faster than any vessel in the fleet could produce. And behind the bow wave, in the disturbed water, I could see the subsurface movement of the creature, not as a visible body, but as a shape in the turbulence, a long continuous disturbance that was moving north through the channel at a pace I would estimate as 20 to 25 knots. It struck the Morna Bell from below and to the port quarter. There is no other way to say this plainly. The vessel was lifted, not partially lifted, not heeled by a wave. The keel of the Morna Bell, all 410 tons of her, rose clear of the water on the back of the creature as it passed beneath her, and in the 2 or 3 seconds that she was elevated, I could see daylight beneath her hull, and the ocean below her, and the white mass of the creature beneath that. Then the creature rolled, as a whale rolls when it has come up beneath something it intends to dislodge, and the Morna Bell came down on her port side and went over. She did not go straight to the bottom. She capsized and lay on her side for perhaps a minute, before settling, and in that minute I could hear men shouting across the water. Captain Pierce's voice was among them, I believe, though I cannot say with certainty. I reached for the Albatross's signal lamp to alert the remaining fleet, and I saw that every other vessel had also seen it, because they were already moving, engines at full, heading north as fast as their holds and the ice channel would permit. I want to be clear about what I did in the next few minutes, and I want to be honest about it, even though it is not easy to be honest about it. I went to Captain Hoke, and I told him that we needed to move north immediately and join the fleet in its withdrawal. I did not recommend that we attempt to recover the Morna Bell's survivors from the water. I made this recommendation because the creature was still in the channel, because it had just demonstrated the capability to capsize a vessel of 400 tons with a single pass, because the Albatross at full speed was our best instrument of communication with the fleet and the best chance of coordinating an escape, and because in my professional judgment, a recovery attempt alongside an upturned hull in the channel at that moment would have resulted in the loss of the Albatross as well, which would have left no surviving vessel and no record of any of what happened. I want the board to weigh that reasoning for themselves. I have weighed it every night since the 20th of February, and I have not reached a settled conclusion. What I am able to say is that the water temperature at that latitude in February will produce incapacitation in an unprotected man within 3 to 4 minutes, and death within 10 to 15, and that the time elapsed between the capsizing and any possible recovery approach would not have left alive anything we could have recovered, and that I knew this when I made my recommendation. Whether that knowledge is a justification or a mechanism for avoiding the fact of a decision I will have to live with, I genuinely cannot tell. Captain Hook followed my recommendation, and we moved north. The fleet was in flight now, all 5 remaining vessels pushing north through the channel at maximum speed, and the channel was not a straight or a generous one. The ice pressed in from both sides in long shelves and pressure ridges, and there were places where the navigable water was no more than 400 yards wide, and in those narrows we had to proceed in single file at reduced speed to avoid collisions, which cost us time we did not have. The pulse was continuous now, a constant low-frequency tone that set the crockery in the wardroom rattling against each other on their hooks, with a thin, persistent sound like distant bells. And the compass needle was circling freely, which meant I was navigating by landmarks and dead reckoning through ice geography that shifted as the pack moved. Captain Amund on the Endurance Star, being the largest and most powerful vessel in the remaining fleet, took the lead position at the front of the column. He was able to break through places where ice had closed partially across the channel and where the smaller trawlers would have had to wait for a lead to open. I was grateful for him being there. I want the board to know that. The creature surfaced again at approximately 5 in the afternoon, and this time it did not surface in the fleet's midst. It surfaced to the east of the column, along the ice margin, and it ran alongside us for what I estimate as 4 or 5 minutes at the speed we were making, the neck and the lateral head visible above the waterline, at a distance of perhaps 400 yards, moving with the fleet as if accompanying it, or as if measuring it, which I believe is the closer description of what it was doing. The head turned repeatedly toward the column of vessels, the same scanning motion I had observed the previous night. Then it sank without making any move toward the vessels, and the disturbance of its submersion reached us as a wave from the east that set all 5 vessels rolling sharply. There was a voice on the radio by this point, or what passed for a radio in those years, a Marconi wireless installation that only the Endurance Star and the Albatross carried, and Amund was using it, terse and matter-of-fact, giving his position and the fleet's status to any station within range. I do not know if any of those transmissions were received. The inquiry has its own records regarding what was heard, and I will defer to those. From my end, the wireless felt like speaking into a room where you could not be sure anyone was listening, but we kept transmitting because it was the only option we had. By late afternoon, the channel had narrowed further, and the ice to the west had begun to carve in long cracks that produced a sound like artillery in the cold air, sharp and percussive, and entirely unlike the organic resonance of the pulse. The carving was being caused by the pressure waves from the creature's movement beneath the shelf ice. I am certain of this, because the pattern of cracks correlated with the sequence of pulses, and the timing was exact. The creature was not incidentally disturbing the ice. It was moving along the underside of the shelf margin, and the pressure of its passage was fracturing it from below, and the fractured sections were falling into the channel ahead of the fleet and behind it, closing the navigable corridor. I realized what this meant before I said it, and I think Amund realized it at approximately the same time, because he came on the wireless and his voice was still controlled, but there was something in it that I had not previously heard from him. "Voss," he said, "it's closing the channel ahead." I confirmed that I saw the same thing from my position behind him. "Then we need to decide which vessel has the best chance of making the open water," he said. I did not answer that immediately, because I knew what the answer was, and I knew what it implied. The Albatross was the fastest vessel in the fleet. She was a tender, built for range and speed rather than cargo capacity, and at full power she could make 14 knots where the trawlers were managing 8 to 10. I had known this for 5 days. I had known it since before we left Hobart, and I had refused to give it any particular weight until that moment, which was the moment it could not be ignored anymore. "The Albatross makes it if the channel stays open long enough," I said. I could hear him breathing through the static. "Is there anyone else?" he said. The Caldera was the next fastest, but she was carrying nearly 60 tons of fish in her hold and was deep in the water for it. At her current load, I estimated she could make perhaps 10 knots under ideal conditions, which these were not. The Grace Solander was lighter, but her engine had been running rough since the previous morning, and I did not trust her speed at extended maximum revolutions. Lund on the Albathin was conservative by nature, and was not pushing his vessel as hard as he could. None of them were the Albatross, and Amund knew it, and I knew it. "Tell me your recommendation, Henrik," he said, and he used my given name, which he had never done on the wireless in any operational context, and that more than anything told me what he was already thinking. "We push through together," I said. "We don't separate the fleet." "The channel is closing," he said. "You can see that." "I can see it. If we all try together, we all stay in the channel long enough for it to close completely, and none of us makes it through." I did not answer. "If one vessel gets through," he said, "at least we know someone reaches port. At least someone knows what happened here." "Rolf," I said, which was also a name I had not used in operational communication, "I am not going to recommend the fleet disperse." "I'm not asking you to recommend it," he said. "I'm asking you to confirm what you see, which is that the Albatross makes it, and the rest of us very probably don't." I looked at the channel ahead. I looked at the ice. I looked at the water between the carving sections and estimated the navigable width and the speed of the closures. I had been a navigator for 11 years, and the mathematics of what I was looking at was not ambiguous. "I see it," I said. There was a pause of perhaps 10 seconds. "Then you know what I'm going to do," he said. "Rolf, listen to me. Get the Albatross to open water, Henrik. Write down everything that happened. Rolf, do not do this. I need you to transmit our position every 30 minutes until you reach port. The consortium needs to know exactly where we were. I am telling you not to do this." But he had already turned the Endurance Star. I watched it happen in the last of the afternoon light, through the wheelhouse glass. The Endurance Star's navigation lights swung as she came through a full 180 degrees, from her heading north to her heading south, directly into the path of the creature that was somewhere behind us in the closing channel. She was 940 tons of steel-hulled trawler running at full revolutions southward, while the remaining 4 vessels ran north. She was placing her hull between the creature and the fleet, and I understood in the clearest possible way that this was not an accident of seamanship or a navigational error. Rolf Amund, who had known these waters most of his life and had run a vessel with calm competence for more than 2 decades, was turning his ship around deliberately. Captain Hoke appeared at my shoulder, and we both watched without speaking. The creature surfaced at the moment the Endurance Star came to its southward heading. It surfaced south of the Endurance Star, perhaps 300 yards, and it rose to a height I could not in good conscience estimate, because by this point the failing afternoon light and the distance made precision impossible. But it was tall enough that it blocked a section of the sky behind it, and the head turned toward the Endurance Star with the same deliberate scanning motion I had observed 3 times before. And then it began to move north, directly toward the Endurance Star, and the Endurance Star held her course south, directly toward it, and they converged in the channel at a rate I calculated but did not want to calculate. I held the wireless transmitter. I did not key it. I did not know what I would have said. The pulse became something else at that moment. It did not increase in frequency or in duration. It simply changed in quality, in a way I cannot describe in terms of frequency or wavelength, because I am not an acoustical engineer, and I do not have the language for it. It became something that I felt in my vision, a trembling at the edges of what I could see, and it became something that made breathing feel effortful, as if the air itself had changed its density. And then it peaked, a single moment of pressure across the entire environment, felt in every surface of every vessel still in the channel. And the Albatross's running lights flickered and went dark for 2 seconds and came back. And somewhere below decks a pipe fitting blew loose, and I heard water beginning to move through the bilge. We were past the narrowest point of the channel. The ice to either side of us was still breaking, carving in long sections that fell into the water behind us. But ahead, the channel was opening, widening into the approach to the open water above the ice margin. And Powell was at the engine telegraph, working the revolutions up to maximum, and the Albatross was doing things with her hull that a 212-ton support tender is not built to do for extended periods. And Captain Hoke was at the wheel, with his hands steady and his face completely still. I turned and looked south. The channel behind us was closing. The ice was falling in large sections across the navigable water, some of them 20 and 30 feet tall as they fell, and the water in the channel was churning from the disturbance. I could see the light from the other trawlers to the north of the Endurance Star's last position, the Caldera and the Grace Solander and the Albathan, still running north, still in the channel, still ahead of the worst of the ice. I could not see the Endurance Star. I could not see the Endurance Star. I kept the glass on the channel to the south for the next 20 minutes as the Albatross ran north and the other trawlers ran with us. And in those 20 minutes I did not see the Endurance Star's running lights again. I did not see her hull. I did not see any sign of her. The pulse had stopped. The continuous low tone that had lived in the timber of our hull for 3 days ceased at some point in those 20 minutes, so gradually that I could not identify the precise moment of its cessation, only notice in retrospect that it had gone. The way you notice the ending of a sound that has been present so long, you stopped identifying it as a sound and began treating it as silence. We came out of the channel into the open water above the ice margin at approximately 7 in the evening of the 20th of February, 1903. The Caldera was 200 yards ahead of us. The Grace Solander was to the northeast. The Albathan came through the channel mouth perhaps 10 minutes after we did, her hull showing ice damage along the port bow from where she had clipped a carving section in the Narrows. All 3 of their captains confirmed by wireless that they were proceeding north. We turned north and we did not stop. I want to tell the board what the next 12 hours were like because I think they belong in this record, even though they are not, strictly speaking, about the creature. We were 4 vessels running north in an Antarctic summer night that was not quite dark, in water that was cold and clear and empty in every direction we could see, and we were running with every lamp burning, and every man on every vessel awake and watching the surface, because none of us could agree on whether the thing was still beneath us, or had remained at the southern end of the channel, or had simply gone to wherever it went when it was not hunting. The pulse did not return. The compasses held their bearings. The surface of the ocean was calm and showed nothing unusual, and after a while, the absence of the pulse became its own unsettling quality, because for 3 days it had been the measure of the creature's proximity, and without it, we had no way to know whether it was 800 fathoms below us or 40. Powell worked the engine room through the entire night without being asked to. He monitored the pressures and the temperatures and the fuel consumption, and he came to me twice with reports, and each time he came, he was entirely composed, which was more than I can say for some of the men who held higher rank. He was 20 years old, and he had seen what he had seen, and he did not come apart, and I want it in the record that he did not. We raised Macquarie Island on the wireless the following morning, the 21st, and received confirmation that our transmissions over the previous days had been received in fragment. The station operator at Macquarie had portions of several transmissions, but not enough context to understand what had occurred, only enough to know that the fleet had reported something anomalous, and that 4 of its 6 vessels were now in contact, and 2 were not. I transmitted a summary of what had occurred, as brief as I could make it and still accurate, and the station operator's response was a long silence, and then a request that I confirm whether I was reporting a vessel collision or a whale strike, because those were apparently the categories available to him for what he was hearing. I said I was reporting neither. We reached Hobart on the 25th of February, 4 days after clearing the channel, having made the best speed the 4 remaining vessels were capable of. I have nothing to say about those 4 days that is relevant to the board's inquiry, except that no man in the fleet slept well, and that when we entered the harbor approaches, I saw the men on the other vessels come out on deck and look at the shore and the buildings and the familiar harbor geometry of Hobart, with the specific quality of relief that belongs to people who were not sure they would see familiar things again. Captain Hoke submitted his vessel's log on arrival. I submitted my navigation notes in whatever form they were still intact, having lost some portion of them when the wave surge in the channel carried water into my cabin through a failing port gasket. The scale that Powell had found along the Albatross's waterline was still in the log chest in my cabin, and when the Harbour Board's inspector came aboard on the morning of the 26th, I showed it to him, and he looked at it for a long time without speaking, and then asked me what it was, and I told him exactly what I am telling this board, which is that it is a scale from the creature that destroyed the Morna Bell and killed Jack Pierce and his crew, and took the Endurance Star and Rolf Amund and his 11 men, and that I cannot tell him what taxonomy that creature belongs to, only that it exists, that it operates in the waters south of Macquarie Island, and that it is capable of the actions I have described. The inspector logged the scale as Exhibit C, and it was removed from my custody. I have not seen it since. The board should know that the Albatross's rudder housing was found, upon the dry dock inspection conducted on the 27th of February, to have been sheared partially away on the port side, with a section of the oak housing displaced outward, in a way that the dry dock surveyor attributed initially to ice strike. I told him I did not believe it was ice strike. I told him I believed the housing had been contacted by the creature during one of the nights in the channel, most likely the first night, when the hull was being tested as I have described, and that the section of displaced oak corresponded to the position along the hull where Powell had found the scale wedged the following morning. The surveyor entered his own judgment in the official record, which I understand was ice strike, and I am not in a position to compel him to change it, but I want the board to have my assessment alongside his, for whatever weight they choose to give it. I said earlier in this testimony that there was something I wanted the board to note before I reached the events of the final day. Something about the vote on the morning of the 19th, when I argued for immediate withdrawal and was overruled 4-1. I want to close the loop on that statement now, because I planted it deliberately, and I believe honesty about the sequence of decisions is the only thing of real value this deposition contains. If the board had asked me at any point between the 19th and the 20th of February whether Rolf Amund would do what he did, I would have said no. I would have said he was too careful, too methodical, too committed to the rational calculus of seamanship to sacrifice himself and his vessel and his crew for any other vessel in the fleet. I knew him for 6 years, and I was wrong about him in the most fundamental way a man can be wrong about another person, which is to mistake what he calculates for what he is. The vote on the 19th was 4-1 because Amund brokered the compromise rather than force the withdrawal, and I have spent the week since asking myself whether he did that because he was genuinely uncertain about the right course, or because he had already, at some level, accepted a version of himself that would end differently from the one I had constructed from 6 years of observation. I cannot answer that question. I will not pretend to. What I know is this. He told me to get the Albatross to open water and to write down everything that happened. I am honoring that instruction now, in front of this board, because it is the only form of payment I am capable of making against a debt that cannot be settled in any other currency. Rolf Amund turned the Endurance Star south in a closing ice channel in failing Antarctic light, with a creature of extraordinary size ahead of him, and he held that course, and he and his 11 men are not here, and I am here instead, and there is no interpretation of those facts that is comfortable to carry. The remaining 4 trawlers, the Caldera, the Grace Solander, the Albathin, and the Albatross, returned to Hobart with approximately 40% of the fish they had taken in the channel, which they had retained through the flight north, rather than jettisoning the catch for speed, a decision made by the individual captains during the night of the 20th, and not by any collective agreement. The consortium accepted the catch. The consortium did not replace the Morna Bell or the Endurance Star, or make any public statement regarding the losses. I believe the Harbour Board's inquiry was opened because certain maritime underwriters with policies on the lost vessels required a formal accounting, and I believe the board is aware of the commercial pressures that have shaped the scope and visibility of this inquiry, and I will leave it to the board's judgment how much of what I have said they choose to enter into the accessible record. I will say one thing more before I conclude, because I believe the board should have it regardless of what they do with the rest. The waters south of Macquarie Island, in the ice-margined channel, at approximately 63 degrees south, contain something that should be treated with the seriousness any large territorial predator commands. The fishing grounds there are exceptional, and other fleets will find their way to them in time, as the commercial pressure to work further south increases. I am asking this board, and through this board anyone who reads the record of this inquiry, to consider whether the value of those grounds justifies sending men into a channel that the creature I have described uses as a hunting corridor. I cannot compel anyone to conclude that it does not justify it. I can tell them what happened to the men who concluded that it did. That is the full extent of my testimony. I have tried throughout to be accurate and to separate what I observed from what I inferred, and where I have drawn inferences, I have tried to identify them as such. I understand that this account, taken as a whole, falls outside the categories of maritime incident that this board normally adjudicates, and I accept that the board may find parts of it difficult to credit. I can offer nothing beyond the testimony of the other surviving captains, the physical condition of the Albatross's rudder housing as documented in the dry dock survey, the scale submitted as Exhibit C, and my 11 years of experience in these waters, which I believe entitle my observations to at least a cautious reading. I have been a sailor for most of my adult life, and I have held a first mate's ticket in this colony for 11 years, and I have never made a false statement under oath, in any proceeding, in any jurisdiction. I am not making one now. The scale is in the board's possession. Whatever the board decides to do with this testimony, I would ask that the scale not be discarded. I have no further claim on it. I simply do not think it should cease to exist. Submitted under oath before the Hobart Harbour Board Inquiry, the 4th day of March, 1903. Deponent, Henrik Voss, First Mate, Support Tender Albatross, Southern Shelf Fishing Consortium Charter. Witnessed by the presiding officer and entered into the inquiry's formal record. I have read the foregoing and affirm its accuracy. The signature below is my own. Henrik Voss. I do not know what I would say to Rolf Amund's family if I were ever asked to say anything. I have not been asked. The consortium paid a settlement and the inquiry closed, and the names of the Endurance Star's 11 men are known in the harbor records, and nowhere much else. There is no monument. There is no formal finding attributing their deaths to any specific cause, because the inquiry's findings were never formalized. The scale from my cabin is in a board evidence room somewhere, entered as Exhibit C on a ledger page that very few people have read, and I have not seen it since February, and I will not see it again. What I see instead is the channel in the afternoon light, the Endurance Star's running lights swinging through their full arc as she came about. I see it clearly. I see it when I sleep, and I see it in the moment before sleep comes. And I see it standing at the Hobart waterfront in the early morning, watching vessels move in and out of the harbor. Vessels that do not know what is in the water further south, and are probably the better for not knowing. I turned north. I gave the order, and we turned north. And I do not know, not with any certainty I have been able to manufacture in the weeks since, whether that was the right thing or only the thing I was able to do, and whether those two descriptions point to the same place, or to two places that are further apart than any latitude I have navigated. I expect I will keep not knowing for a long time,